One of my favorite books on politics is Jonah Goldberg's Tyranny of Clichés. The book begins like this.
There's a kind of argument that isn't an argument that vexes me. I first started to notice it on university campuses. I've spoken to a lot of college audiences. Often, I will encounter an earnest student, much more serious-looking than the typical hippie with open-toed shoes and a closed mind. During the Q&A session, after my speech, he'll say something like, "Mr. Goldberg, I may disagree with what you have to say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it." Then I'll sit down, and the audience will applaud. Faculty will nod proudly at this wiser-than-his-years hatchling under their wings. What a glorious moment for everybody! Blessed are the bridge builders! My response? Who gives a rat? First of all, my right to speak was never in doubt. Indeed, I'm usually paid to speak. Besides, I've given my speech already, and we're in Q&A time. Shouldn't you have told me this beforehand? Second, the kid is almost surely lying. He'll take a bullet for me? Really? Clichés like these are a way to earn bravery on the cheap, defending principles you haven't thought through or perhaps only vaguely support. Or heck, maybe he really would leap on a grenade so I could finish talking about how stupid high-speed rail is. But it still doesn't matter because mounting these sorts of clichés is a way to avoid arguments, not make them.
When I first read that passage, I couldn't help but think of YouTube's erstwhile skeptic community, the people on the internet best known for applauding themselves for believing in free speech.
I think it's the old quote of, "I don't like what you're saying, but I'll fight to the death to defend your right to say it."
Yeah,
and
it's the misquotation of Voltaire.
Not that it's terribly important, that quotation is likely apocryphal. And for what it's worth, Voltaire was also being sarcastic and droll if you actually understand the context in which he supposedly said that. But I digress. If there's one cliché in YouTube politics that most people don't really understand or really support, that is used to earn bravery on the cheap while actually avoiding talking about things, it's free speech. The myriad ways in which the term free speech is used and misused here on the internet is one of my biggest pet peeves. So what is free speech? Well, the most prevalent definition among the self-proclaimed free speech warriors is the ability to speak without fear of consequences.
Free expression, free speech, liberty, true liberty. To say what you wish, without fear of consequence.
This is what I call de facto free speech. Any constraints from anyone on anything you say are by definition illiberal and unreasonable within a free society. For example, if you're a white person in America, you cannot effectively say the N-word unless you're ready to get into a world of trouble. You may have noticed that I no longer swear on this channel, and that I bleep profanity out from other people because I don't want my videos to get demonetized. There are no laws enforcing these things, but they are effectively rules that most of us live by because we don't want to deal with the consequences. Then there is the counter to this, which is best encapsulated by this webcomic. The stick figure says, "Public service announcement. The right to free speech means the government can't arrest you for what you say. It doesn't mean that anyone else has to listen to your bullshit or host you while you share it. The First Amendment doesn't shield you from criticism or consequences. If you're yelled at, boycotted, have your show canceled, or get banned from an internet community, your free speech rights aren't being violated. It's just that the people listening think you're an and they're showing you the door." This is what I call de jure free speech. It's the idea that only the government can ever threaten your free speech. It's pretty self-explanatory, and the free speech warriors do not approve. So where do I stand? Well, I'm much more with the latter, but I don't think it's quite right either. I believe that freedom of speech is the ability to speak free of violence. No one can hurt you, threaten you, or physically damage your property because of something you said. This obviously means that the government cannot pass laws against speech, but it also entails certain obligations from the government. If violence is being used against someone because of something they said, the state must take the side of the speaker, even if what the speaker said is absolutely heinous. This also brings clarity to most of the exceptions of the First Amendment. For example, child pornography isn't allowed because the production necessarily involves violence towards children. This is not to say that the de facto free speech crowd doesn't have legitimate grievances. We do have problems with cancel culture, people are too quick to boycotts, and political correctness is an attempt to shape the way we talk, and it can be unreasonable. The idea that political correctness is the greatest threat to free speech has been made by the likes of Dave Rubin here on the internet. But the first person I heard say it was the late Andrew Breitbart.
I've always said it was political correctness because if you can't speak openly and freely without being accused in a reactionary manner as being a fascist or a racist or a sexist or a homophobe or an anti-Muslim, what it does is it chills free speech.
Political correctness works by going after your reputation. Almost no one wants to be thought of as a racist, a sexist, or whatever. But the problem is, there is no magic principle that protects your reputation from the things you say. Yes, people do throw around these buzzwords willy-nilly, and it does oftentimes bully people into not speaking their minds. The thing is, I know very few people who think that those things aren't actually bad, and that the people for whom they genuinely apply deserve to be ostracized from polite society. It's more so that these terms are being applied incorrectly or opportunistically, rather than being bad per se. All other flaws aside, if we just take de facto free speech at its face value, it's self-defeating. The champions of this sense of free speech are not seeking the elimination of taboos or informal pressures against speech, as their rhetoric would suggest. They are just trying to create different ones. After all, the people who use terms like racist and sexist are just using their free speech. And the free speech warriors are just trying to create new taboos and social pressure against that. I don't view these projects as equal, nor do I think that the people engaged in them have the same amount of influence on society. My point is that everyone has their own standards for what is and isn't acceptable to say within a free society. The free speech warriors talk as if they want to jettison all taboos and informal pressures. Except they actually don't want to do that because it's essentially impossible. If we actually lived in a society where there were no consequences for saying something, that would make speech literally inconsequential. Furthermore, pushing back against political correctness on the grounds of free speech is not only absurd, I believe it's done enormous damage in the case against PC culture. But it doesn't stop there though. People like Tucker Carlson not only rail against things like boycotts and disassociation, they want politicians to use the power of their respective offices to bring digital media companies like YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter in line with their own standards.
What we're watching now in real time is this country become unfree. So the question is, who exactly is defending us in all of this? Us who might dissent from Mark Zuckerberg's view or think that NBC News maybe doesn't tell the whole truth all the time, or don't trust Mark Zuckerberg to control what we think. What about us? Who's standing up for us? Where are leaders in Congress? Where's the White House? Nowhere. As long as big tech isn't hassling them personally and directly, as long as their accounts remain open, they don't seem to care. They're fools.
So they don't want the government dictating what people can and can't say, but they're okay with using the power of the state to crack down on companies using their private property in ways they don't personally approve of. For what it's worth, I don't like the way digital media companies conduct themselves in these regards either. But you either believe in private property rights or you don't. You only believe in liberty when you believe people should be free to do things you don't personally approve of. Yes, free speech is part of living in a free society. A very important part. But cancel culture, boycotts, social stigma, disassociation, free markets, and private property are also part of living in a free society. So, this is what I mean when I say free speech is a cliche. The people who resist these things on the grounds of free speech are pretending as if they're invoking the principles of liberty, when in reality, they're resisting them. There's also another little trick that people like to do when invoking free speech. As I laid out earlier, there are two different, competing, mutually exclusive concepts of free speech in common usage. Well, there's a little trick of equivocation that certain people like to pull. Now, if there's one person here on YouTube who believes in free speech, it's Dave Rubin.
Let's talk about free speech. Free speech, 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 free speech.
He's been very clear from the outset of his show that it's in fact not the government, but political correctness that is the greatest threat to free speech.
So this is tough. So one of the questions we get most at these Jordan Peterson events and when I do the stand-up events and whatever else is people that are kind of afraid to say what they think. And often we get this at colleges where kids are afraid to say what they think to their professors because they don't want their grades to be hurt. But we get this all the time from people that are afraid to say that they, I'm for low taxes, and people are going to say you're racist and then you're going to get fired or something like that. Or you'll be on the outs at your job. Now that's not for a famous person. That's just for the day-to-day person, and that's most of us, right? So that's pretty freaking scary. That there is a huge amount of people in the West walking around afraid to say what they think. That's why years ago I was saying this thing about I'm not afraid right now, and I still stand by this. I said this about 2 years ago. I am not afraid of the government coming for my free speech right now. I am afraid that the masses are actively silencing themselves.
Again, I don't really think that makes sense for reasons that I've laid out, but I understand that Rubin feels differently. Until he doesn't. Remember a couple of years ago when Colin Kaepernick was taking a knee during the national anthem as a form of protest against police violence? That protest was dying out until President Trump stuck his fat orange nose into the situation and reignited passions around it.
Wouldn't you love to see one of these NFL owners, when somebody disrespects our flag, to say, get that son of a bitch off the field right now, out, he's fired. He's fired!
Jay Nordlinger called Trump a political arsonist for inflaming a situation for his own political benefit that I seriously doubt he actually cares about. Trump invoked the right wing's version of outrage culture, what I've heard called patriotic correctness. Those of you who were around post 9/11 will remember this particular cultural sensitivity. Conservatives do not like it if you disparage America or the military and are willing to invoke all of the social pressures the left does in the name of political correctness. When Colin Kaepernick kneeled for the anthem, the NFL faced outrage and even boycotts from them and their advertisers from certain members of their fan base. So how did Dave Rubin react to this? Well, in fairness to him, he started out by talking about the chilling effect it might have on free speech, but then went on to say that it's Trump's right to say this, which is obvious to anyone with a brain, but thanks, Dave. And then he said this.
So again, to be clear here, even if Trump isn't saying or tweeting statements just as I'd like him to, he does have the exact same right to free speech the rest of us have. Now, if he tried to instruct federal agencies to punish players or football teams for exercising their right to free speech, we would have an illegal act and most likely an impeachable offense. As far as I can see, he didn't do that, though he did intentionally inflame the situation by getting as close to seeming to use government authority to silence people without quite doing so. Understanding that Trump said something but didn't sign an executive action on it is an important distinction, though, because words are not action even when those words are uttered by the President of the United States.
So let's recap here. If some SJWs on Twitter call you a racist, it's a threat to your free speech. But if the most powerful man alive calls for you to get fired, hey, it's his right, and as long as he doesn't use the power of his office, it's all fair game. Tucker Carlson has pulled this same trick. When there were boycotts against his advertisers on his program, he came out and said that the left was coming for his free speech.
Recently, the Poynter Institute, which is a nonprofit that's supposed to support journalism, put out a list of what they called unreliable news outlets. Can you imagine unreliable? Self-awareness in short supply in the journalism business. But Poynter crafted this list with the help of the Southern Poverty Law Center. So you can imagine who made the list. The Washington Free Beacon, the Daily Caller, the Daily Signal, the Washington Examiner, basically everyone who's not CNN or MSNBC or precisely aligned with their politics. Poynter called for advertisers to blacklist and therefore bankrupt these news outlets, crush them. Their fellow progressives applauded. As far as they're concerned, this is total war. What we're watching now in real time is this country become unfree.
Yet, during his debate with Cenk Uygur at Politicon, when he was asked about Kaepernick, a guy who has faced similar boycotts, this was his response.
But Tucker, for a guy who's as vigilant about protecting speech, I am curious, and again, this is genuine, why you don't support the free speech rights of Colin Kaepernick.
That's really funny. You know, I was just worrying if like Nike pitchman had enough power in our society. I think he's okay. I've never challenged his speech rights. I mean, ever. I've never challenged anybody's speech rights. I mean, there's not a wacko I wouldn't defend on speech grounds, and I have defended a lot of crazy people on speech grounds, including Colin Kaepernick, who I think is a buffoon.
So when Tucker faces social pressure himself for the things that he says, they're coming for his free speech. But when it happens to someone he doesn't like and doesn't agree with, these things are really immaterial because Kaepernick still has his right. When Alex Jones got banned off almost all digital media, Sargon of Akkad called for government intervention because these companies are so important for the purposes of free speech.
And what Silicon Valley has just realized is that they have almost exclusive power of arbitration. That's way too much power for a bunch of private companies to have. I'm sorry. It's just too much. I'm certain that one day social media will be totally decentralized. We won't need people like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, etc. But in the meantime, while we still do need them, I think they should be regulated to reduce their overall power over society. Because I don't think these people deserve as much power as they have. And I don't think anyone knew they were going to have this much power.
Yet when Carl got Chrisiosity temporarily banned from Twitter, he said that it wasn't about free speech because it doesn't concern the government. It's not just these guys, by the way. Lots of people have done this, including people I actually respect and admire. In half their moods, free speech warriors have incredibly expansive view of this principle they claim to love. Yet when it serves their purposes, they'll claim that free speech only concerns the government. They'll shift from de facto free speech to de jure free speech and back, based on the circumstances involved. All the while claiming to be driven by principle and applauding themselves for being such great champions of liberty.
Bye.